All right, hello to our friends who are joining us via recording. Today we are covering the spinal cord as well as the bones and muscles of the back. So to get us diving into this material, I want to first start with a little bit of review of something that we just talked about in lecture. Get my pointer. Remember that when we are talking about the brain, we find the gray matter of the brain on the outside and the white matter of the brain on the inside. But when we're talking about the spinal cord, we have the white matter of the spinal cord on the outside and the gray matter of the spinal cord in the middle. Do we happen to remember from our lecture today, did we say that gray matter or white matter was better at processing things? Was it the gray matter or the white matter that we said was processing? Yeah, exactly. So when we talk about processing, that work is done by the gray matter, either of the brain on the outside or of the spinal cord on the inside. The white matter on the outside helps us to send messages quickly. So as we start talking about the spinal cord, when we're talking about needing to get information up or down from the brain really fast, that's going to be the job of the white matter here on the outside. When we're talking about needing to process things or predict what we should do, that's the job of the gray matter in the middle. So when we look at the spinal cord, one of the first things for us to be familiar with is the fact that the spinal cord is covered in meninges just like the brain was. So remember those connective tissue layers that we labeled twice on that weird meninges model? Remember that the layer that was closest to the brain, which is also the same as the layer that's closest to the spinal cord, is this outer layer called the pia mater. So the pia mater attaches to the spinal cord just like it attaches to the brain. It's actually literally connected to each other. So the meninges from the brain go down onto the spinal cord. In particular, the pia mater goes down onto the spinal cord. Then, just like around the brain, on the outside of the pia mater is the arachnoid mater, the spider web looking layer, and on the very outside is the dura mater. So these are in the exact same order, and they're literally connected to the layers that we had around the brain. When we look inside the spinal cord, we have a lot of new structures to learn this week. So I'm going to get out my colors here. We're going to label together. I need everyone to underline, highlight, star this right here, dorsal root ganglion. I want us to underline, highlight, star this term. The dorsal root ganglion is what I see right here, this bump right here. And I see it over here as well, the dorsal root ganglion. The reason we are underline, highlight, starring that is because every time you look at a spinal cord model, that is the very first thing you're always looking for. The dorsal root ganglion helps me to know the front from the back of the spinal cord. So the dorsal root ganglion, this ganglion word just means a bump. The bump on my nerve on the back side of the spinal cord, the dorsal root ganglion. So this dorsal word means back. The ventral word means front. Many of the structures that we're learning today just have to do with, is it on the front? Is it on the back? So the dorsal root ganglion is the bump that's on the dorsal side. It's on the back side. And the dorsal root ganglion is found on the dorsal root. So the dorsal root is just the part that I see right here that's next to that bump. So the dorsal root is where my neurons that are going into the spinal cord, this is how they get into the spinal cord using the dorsal root. And it just so happens that on that root, there is a bump called the dorsal root ganglion. Neurons that come into the spinal cord from the dorsal root are going into this region back here. This region back here is called the dorsal horn. The dorsal horn. So notice our theme here, dorsal is always on the backside, the dorsal gray horn or the dorsal horn on the backside. The one other thing with the word dorsal in its name is this thing called the dorsal median sulcus. And the dorsal median sulcus is this indentation that I see in the backside. So dividing the left from the right in the back is the dorsal median sulcus. I'm seeing a question from Seth about keeping the spinal cord from leaking cerebrospinal fluid. None of the structures, well, the meninges would help to keep it from leaking out that fluid. We do also have, it's hard to see in this picture, but we do also have that central canal, and the central canal is completely surrounded by nervous tissue. So because of that, it wouldn't be able to leak that cerebrospinal fluid either. So I'm not sure if you're referring to the meninges or the spinal cord structures, but we do have both of those things to keep us from leaking our cerebrospinal fluid. All right, go back to my chat. All right, so we've done everything with dorsal in its name. Dorsal means the back side. Now we're going to go into what we have on the front side of the spinal cord. On the front side of the spinal cord, we're going to use the word ventral. So ventral means the front. So I have a ventral gray horn that I find up here on the front side of the spinal cord, number 7. There's my ventral horn. And my ventral horn has connected to it coming off a ventral root. Just like we had a dorsal root, the ventral root is on the front side, the ventral root. The ventral median fissure is the space on the front side that divides the left and the right from each other. The ventral median fissure, dividing the left and the right on the front side. The only things that we have left then, the first one that we have left is the spinal nerve. So a spinal nerve, which is number 26 right here, a spinal nerve is made out of a dorsal root and a ventral root. So a set of nerves that go to the back and a set of nerves that go to the front, those come together to make my spinal nerve. So out very far is the spinal nerve. Closer to the spinal cord, we have that dorsal root and that ventral root. They come together to make a spinal nerve. If we go back inside the spinal cord, in addition to the dorsal gray horn in the back, the ventral gray horn in the front, we also have a lateral gray horn on the side. So the lateral gray horn is more on the side, the lateral gray horn. And the other structure that we're asking you to label are the white matter funiculi. That word funiculi, in lecture, we called those tracts. Tracts and funiculi are the same thing. And when we're talking about how to label those on our spinal cord model, it's literally anywhere where there's white matter. All of the white matter of the spinal cord all the way around is filled with these tracts. It's filled with groups of neurons that are all traveling up and down together. So when you're working on the homework assignment and it asks you to click on the white matter funiculi, you can click anywhere in the white matter. All of that is those funiculi, or all of that is those tracts. Any structures you would like me to clarify, or give me a thumbs up if we feel good about this particular spinal cord model. So number 8 and 9, I'm not going to ask you about on this model. Number 9 is representing the central canal, and that's what we're going to look at better on a different model. It's hard to tell in this picture that that is representing a spot. So for this particular model, I will not ask you about those structures. But good clarifying question. Yeah. We have a much better central canal coming soon. I can't run through everything. Everything is labeled. I will also post the recording of this if you'd like to go back and watch me labeling everything again as well. All right, I'm going to bump to, let me see. Let's do a couple of things. On this one, I'll mention a structure that we couldn't see before on my other model. If you notice this black circle right here in the middle, this black circle is the central canal. So remember from lab last week, we talked about how cerebrospinal fluid goes into the spinal cord when we're done with it. So the central canal is where cerebrospinal fluid is going into the spinal cord in the very middle of the spinal cord. We can still see those same structures that we saw before. I'll point out, oh, lost my pointer here. I'll point out that my lateral horn is a little bit funky looking on this one, but there's that lateral horn in the side. Then we'd have our ventral horn in the front, the ventral horn. By the way, the reason I know that this is the ventral side is because of that structure that I told you to always start with or always look for at the beginning. This thing back here. This bump right here is that structure that we call the dorsal root ganglion. So the dorsal root ganglion tells me which side is the back side and which side is the front side. The front side, the ventral side, is opposite of where the dorsal root ganglion is. I'll mention, because this will come up in a moment, that different kinds of neurons live in different horns of the spinal cord. So that's why we're talking about their different names. If we've got the dorsal horn in the very back, so there's that dorsal horn, the ventral horn in the front, and the lateral horn as well. We have different types of neurons that live in those places. I'll briefly mention a couple of the structures on here as well. This model very clearly shows me where those spinal nerves are. So remember that a spinal nerve is made out of a dorsal root and a ventral root that come together. So I can see those spinal nerves where a dorsal root and a ventral root have come together. So here is, let me label it, my spinal nerve. So my dorsal root, I can tell which one it is because of my big bump right here. My dorsal root ganglion, my big bump. It's on my dorsal root, like its name says. So my dorsal root is all of the stuff going into the back side of the spinal cord. All of the stuff coming out of the front side of the spinal cord, all of this is my ventral root. So the ventral root comes out of the front side, the dorsal root goes into the back side. And remind me, when I ask you for this word funiculi, where are the funiculi located? Where did we say that we could click for the funiculi? Do we remember? We don't remember. That's okay. When we talk about funiculi, we can click anywhere where it's white. Exactly. Yep, any of the places on the spinal cord that are white. So all of these spaces here, all of this space over here, all the places where I have white matter, all of those have groups of neurons that are traveling together. So the funiculi, we can click anywhere that we want to, as long as it's not one of my horns, which is where the gray matter is found. All right, so let me see. Okay. You have a space in your packet. If we were in lab together, I would have you pull out the spinal cord slide, and we wouldn't put it on a microscope. We would just hold it up to the light to look at it. I've got a couple of pictures that show the cross section of the spinal cord on a slide as well. So you can use these things to sketch for yourself what it looks like. And I will tell you that there are some questions on the homework assignment that do show a cross section of the spinal cord from a slide. So it's not just our models that we need to identify things. It's also when we're looking at slides as well. So some of the structures that we've labeled together already, we talked about that central canal, the open space in the very middle of my spinal cord, except it's not open when we're alive, right? In the very center when we're alive, that's where we find cerebrospinal fluid. When we're looking at this spinal cord, there's this big mass of tissue over here and the big mass of tissue over here, as they have labeled, that's that thing I always told you to look for, the dorsal root ganglion. And that's important because remember, that helps me to know that back here is my dorsal side. And that means that up here is my ventral side. So I need to know my front from my back to help me identify my horns. I'll mention that you see on here, these particular labels, they use the words posterior and anterior. That's the same thing as dorsal and ventral. It's just another set of words to use. So the dorsal horn is always in the back. The ventral horn is always in the front. The lateral horn is a little harder to see in this one, but it's always going to be generally on the side of my gray matter that I see in the spinal cord. So a couple other pictures just to show us the same thing for that sketch that we're doing. When you're trying to identify dorsal from ventral too, these ones don't necessarily have a clear dorsal root ganglion on them, but my dorsal horn, let me find where my pointing go, okay? My dorsal horn is the one that actually goes back and touches the back. The ventral horn doesn't actually touch the back, or doesn't actually touch the front, excuse me. So this would be my dorsal side on these ones, the dorsal side where it goes back and it touches. Yeah, you're totally right, Kaylee. That is one of the things that people compare the gray matter of the spinal cord to, things like a butterfly. And it looks a little bit different, right, depending on where we are in the spinal cord. So different parts of the spinal cord might look a little bit more if I chop them up a little bit more like this one, compared to when I chop it up like this. And that other part that we were looking at, so I'll bounce back here, this one where we can maybe a little bit more clearly see a lateral horn, that would be a different place in the spinal cord as well. So we always have that gray matter in the middle, but its shape changes a little bit depending on where we are, how high up or how far down we are in the spinal cord. So I mentioned for you, let me see if I have a, I mentioned for you that we have different neurons that live in different places of the spinal cord. So I'm going to help you with matching up a few of your functions. I'm doing a little bit indirectly because I'm going to use a picture to help me do it. So let's talk about some of the different kinds of things that I find in the spinal cord, in and around the spinal cord. So we'll start with the term that we had mentioned already. We had mentioned that a spinal nerve comes when I put together a dorsal root and a ventral root. So where my dorsal root and ventral root are together, we make this thing called a spinal nerve. Now, the reason I have a dorsal root and a ventral root is because I actually have different kinds of information that are going into or out of my spinal cord on these different sides. So my dorsal root that we see here in the back is sending information into the spinal cord. My dorsal root has sensory information. So my dorsal root, which is attached to the spinal cord, this brings sensory information into the spinal cord. So I will mention for you that when we talk about the location where sensory neurons live in this bump. The dorsal root and that thing called the dorsal root ganglion. This is the location where neurons live going into the spinal cord. So sensory neurons collect information, they bring it into the spinal cord. Amuche, if you're having trouble seeing, perhaps log back out and log back in. See if that makes it show up for you. All right, sensory information comes in through the dorsal root. Then we process it here in the dorsal horn. So here's the dorsal horn, and the dorsal horn is the location of my interneurons, my processing neurons. So interneurons or processors, I'll type their full name in the chat, interneurons. Depending on the kind of sensory information that's coming in, we would have different sets of neurons that process it. So if it's information coming from your fingers, that would go to a different place than information coming from your stomach, for example. So the dorsal horn has interneurons in it. Then we go into our two types. Let me pull up my pointer again. Our two types of motor neurons that we find in the spinal cord. So when we're talking about the ventral horn of the spinal cord, so here's my ventral horn. The ventral horn of the spinal cord is where I find what we call somatic motor neurons. Somatic motor neurons. I believe that's the word that that is used in your lab packet. Is that correct? That it has the word somatic, or does it have a different word for those neurons? I forgot to bring the packet with me. I apologize. Let me type it in the chat. Somatic motor neurons. Is that somewhere in there, or am I using the wrong term for it? We're scouring, trying to see if we can figure it out. Don't see it. Okay. You have autonomic somewhere, right? Do we have autonomic? Let me see if I have any other words to help me out here. Let me do a little digging. I'll find out what word it is that we do actually use. That's the problem with anatomy, right? We've got lots of words for the exact same things. Let's see what we're calling it right now. Okay, I don't think we specifically named them, but when we are on page 2 of your lab packet, on page 2, this is where we're kind of working on, where we're filling in the parts of the spinal cord and what kind of neurons live there. When we're talking about the motor neurons that leave the anterior side of the spinal cord and they go to skeletal muscles and glands. Skeletal muscles and glands. That's what Dr. Allis means by somatic neurons. So my motor neurons, primarily that control the movements of your body, they live in the ventral gray horn. They live in the front. If you go down a bit, let's see. It says the region of gray matter that is lateral in the spinal cord. Here, I'll pull over my worksheet here for a moment. When we talk about the region of gray matter that's lateral in the spinal cord, that's going to be that lateral gray horn. The lateral gray horn has autonomic motor neurons. Autonomic motor neurons are neurons that control smooth muscle and that control cardiac muscle. So our horns each have different kinds of neurons in them. If I live in the lateral gray horn, my job is to control the action of smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. If I live in the ventral gray horn, my job is to control skeletal muscles. If I live in the dorsal gray horn, that's where those interneurons are found, in the dorsal gray horn. let me see as well. Yep, and then the last one that we've talked about is right here. The enlargement that I find on the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, which is where I find my sensory neurons. My sensory neurons live in the dorsal root ganglion. So we've got some terminology. The dorsal, let me have a pointer, the dorsal root ganglion is where sensory neurons live. They send their information into the dorsal gray horn. The dorsal gray horn is where interneurons live. They process the sensory information. They tell either my motor neurons that go to skeletal muscle in this ventral gray horn, or my motor neurons in the lateral gray horn, the ones that go to smooth muscle or cardiac muscle. They tell those what to do. And those will leave in my ventral root. My ventral root has motor neurons. We'll send my motor messages out and split them to where they need to go in the body. When I build, so again, when I build a spinal nerve, it has sensory information and motor information. Some of that sensory information comes from the back side of the body, and some of that motor information goes to the back side of the body. Some of it goes toward the front side of the body. So when we talk about a ramus, and this is something that I'm not sure if I only have, I think, one model that shows me a ramus. The dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus are places where I split to send neurons to the back side of the body or the front side of the body. So not a trick question. If I'm calling it the dorsal ramus, do we think the dorsal ramus would be on the front side or the back side of the body? The dorsal ramus. Exactly. Yep. Dorsal always means on the back. So the dorsal ramus goes toward the back side of the body, collects information or controls the muscles that live back there. The ventral ramus goes toward the front side of the body, and that's going to help me to control a lot of my organs and take care of some of that kind of stuff. So the only model I have that shows me these rami at all, at least a little bit, is this model right here. And this model right here shows me the spinal cord when it's inside a vertebra. Before we label spinal cord structures, I want to point out a couple of things on this model that make this a special kind of vertebrae. So I'm going to type in the chat here the kind of vertebrae that we see in this picture is a cervical vertebra. When I talk about the cervical region, do you remember which part of your body has the cervical region? Where's the cervical region of your body? Any ideas? Exactly. Yep. The cervical region is the neck region of your body. The vertebrae that live in your neck look a little bit different than the vertebrae that live in other places. There are two bone markings on this vertebra that help me to know it's a cervical vertebra. Bone marking number one, this thing up here. This thing up here is called a bifid spinous process. Bifid spinous process. The fact that the top of my vertebra has two branches that come off of this, bifid spinous process. That's the first way that I know that this is a cervical vertebra. The second way that I know that this is a cervical vertebra is because of this space right here where I can see blood vessels, and I can see it over here as well. This space that I'm seeing over here is not a marking we had you label on this picture, but we will have you label it later. This is called a transverse foramen. I'm typing it in the chat. Transverse foramen. A foramen is always a hole. When we look at cervical vertebrae, they've got this hole on the outside for blood vessels that are going up to the brain. So that's a transverse foramen, a hole on the outside of the spinal cord, or the vertebrae, excuse me. And then we also have, remember we talked about this bifid spinous process up here at the top. We have labeled most of the other structures that are on here, but I want to make sure to point out a couple of important ones. One of the things I want to point out is, see this little branch going toward the back up here? This little branch going toward the back, that is my dorsal ramus. Dorsal ramus, the group of neurons that goes toward the backside. Remember that we've got our big dorsal root ganglion, the big bump, dorsal root ganglion, which means that attached to it, we can see the dorsal root on the backside, and you can also see that ventral root on the front side. It's a little bit challenging on this model to tell exactly where there's a spinal nerve, but it's basically this little section right here. So I'm going to abbreviate spinal nerve, this little section right here, because my dorsal ramus branched, and here's that ventral ramus as well, the ventral ramus down toward the front. So I've just got a teeny tiny spinal nerve. And if I look over on this side, it's the same deal. This little space before it splits, there's my little spinal nerve inside there, spinal nerve. The only other thing I'm going to label with you together right now are my meningeal layers, those connective tissue layers that are around it. So the first connective tissue layer that we see touching the spinal cord is number 24. So what I'm going to do is actually color on top of it, but if you like to label the numbers, we're talking about number 24. This is the one that's attached to the spinal cord. I'm doing a terrible job coloring it here. But number 24, this is the pia mater, the layer that's directly attached to the spinal cord, the pia mater. Then we've got an open space, and we go to number 11. Number 11 is what they have labeled the red line. So I'm going to make number 11 red. Number 11 is representing my next meningeal layer. My next meningeal layer was the arachnoid mater. So the arachnoid mater, hey, remember, just like how in the brain we had the subarachnoid space, we have that in between the meninges of the spinal cord as well. So we're not making you label it, but that space that's labeled number 13, that's the subarachnoid space where cerebral spinal fluid would be floating around. And then on the very outside of the red line, we've got number 9. This is the thickest meningeal layer. This thick meningeal layer here on the outside is the dura mater. The dura mater. I'll mention something that we're going to talk about in lecture next week as we move into unit number 4. If you noticed here how it has labeled number 10, we've got this area with some blood vessels and with some yellow stuff. This area out here, number 10, is something called the epidural space. The epidural space is filled with adipose tissue, and if during childbirth a woman gets an epidural, this is the place where that medication is inserted. So on the outside of all the other meninges, we've got the epidural space that I see out here filled with fat. So everything that we're naming down here below that. I believe that is it for what I'm going to cover with you on cross-section of the spinal cord. Do we have any last-minute questions before we move on? Yes, Liza mentioned it's a small space for some major relief. It's very true. Yes, it's a small space that we want to make sure we stay inside of and don't actually accidentally go somewhere we're not supposed to as well. So makes a big difference as long as it's in the right place. Absolutely. I would love some emojis or GIFs. Let me know that we're still here. If you are still at your computer, shoot me something. Emoji, GIF, otherwise. Let's see if I can find something. I looked up spine and this is what I got. Cactus. That seems appropriate. Feeling a little prickly. All right. Well, we're going to switch gears. Yeah, Kaylee's frantically writing. Love it. We're going to switch gears from looking inside the spinal cord to now we're going to look outside at the spinal cord as a whole. So you've got a big picture in your notes that represents this whole model. I kind of blew up some of the parts to help us see things a little bit better. So we're going to go through here and label some of these important parts for us to be aware of. And then we're going to talk about another model that shows me what happens after what's attached to here. So the first thing for me to point out for you is this that I see right here. This is my spinal cord going all the way down inside the vertebral column. When we look at the spinal cord, there are some parts of it that are bigger than others. So if you notice this section right here, how it got a little bit wider right here, this is something called the cervical enlargement. The cervical enlargement. We have spaces where our spinal cord gets wider because a bunch of neurons that are going out to other parts of the body, they start there. So in the case of the cervical enlargement, this is a location where my neurons that are going out into the arms are coming from. When we look at the spinal cord, attached everywhere, we have little groups of nerves that are coming off. So up here, starting around here and kind of all the way down through this region, all of these are cervical nerves. Cervical nerves. Then you can see all of these down here. These are all thoracic nerves. So coming off of the spinal cord, nerves that attach to and then go places. But in some of the places, the nerves make some things called plexuses. Put that in the chat for us, plexuses. Plexuses are where my neurons share, or where my nerves share neurons with each other. We essentially weave things together to make it so that if one nerve were to get damaged, it's okay, I can still get information or send information anyway. So the first place that I have plexuses, I'm going to switch colors too. The first place I have a plexus is up here at the very top. So up here at the very top where I kind of see a mess of stuff going on, this up here is called my cervical plexus. Cervical plexus. We are not making you learn any of the nerves from the cervical plexus, but the one nerve of note that I'll mention from up there is called the phrenic nerve. And the phrenic nerve controls your diaphragm. So when you have hiccups, you can blame that phrenic nerve because it's firing a little bit irregularly. So I'll spell it for you. I'm not going to ask you about it, but it is out there, the phrenic nerve involved in controlling the diaphragm. Down below the cervical plexus, then we get into this space right here. And this space right here is the brachial plexus. So the brachial plexus is a group of nerves that come off the spinal cord. These are the nerves that we're talking about. So these guys right here, these are called the brachial nerves. They go down into the arm and control different muscles, collect sensory information from different places. So the brachial plexus, what I see up here. Other than that, there are a few cranial nerves that I'll mention on this model that we can see. We can see, if you look up here at the top, we can see cranial nerve number 1, the olfactory nerve number 1. Down below it, you can see that crisscross for number 2. Back here in the middle, I can't remember if we asked you to ID it or not, but back here in the middle, there's number 3. And we can also pretty clearly see number 6 right here in the middle as well. So just a few cranial nerves that we can see here at the brainstem. When we go down in the spinal cord, so now I've zoomed in closer to the bottom part of the spinal cord. I'll bounce back. Kaylee asked a clarifying question. If the brachial nerves are the same as the brachial plexus, they are not exactly the same. So the brachial plexus is kind of what we see going on in this area. So from over all of this stuff, where my nerves are sharing neurons with each other, that's the plexus. When we get out into the individual nerves that are coming out into the arm, those are the brachial nerves. So the brachial plexus is a group of nerves that are sharing neurons with each other, building the brachial nerves down farther. So good clarifying question. The plexuses are always closer to the spinal cord. The nerves are always a little bit farther from the spinal cord. So if we move down into the second half of the spinal cord, the first thing I'll point out, let me get my pointer back, is this little space right here. See this little triangle kind of thing right here? This is something we need to be familiar with. This is called the conus medullaris. The conus medullaris is the cone-shaped end of the spinal cord. So the spinal cord actually does not go all the way to the bottom of your vertebral column. It starts around the level of the second or the third lumbar vertebrae. So it doesn't extend all the way down. We've got this cone-shaped end around what we call L1 or L2. Since the spinal cord does not go all the way to the bottom of the vertebral column, we've got this little strip of connective tissue that I did a terrible job coloring on top of. Little strip of connective tissue that I see around there called filum terminale. Filum terminale. Filum terminale holds conus medullaris in place. It makes sure that your spinal cord isn't bouncing back and forth inside the vertebral column because there's some space in there. We want to make sure that it stays down flat. Because the spinal cord doesn't go all the way to the end of the vertebral column, we have to have a bunch of little nerves that we see down here. I'm coloring them here in green. All these little nerves that are inside of the vertebral column, places where the spinal cord would have been. These nerves together are something called the cauda equina. Cauda equina. Cauda equina means horsetail. So the cauda equina is the group of nerves that come off of the conus medullaris and go down and fill up the vertebral column to the very bottom, the cauda equina. Just like we saw before, we do have some plexuses down here as well. So the lumbar plexus is the first one that I see up a little bit higher. Here's that lumbar plexus. And down toward the very bottom, we also have the sacral plexus. And the deal with the sacral plexus is that this one has the biggest nerve in your entire body in it. The biggest nerve in your entire body is called the sciatic nerve. So when we're looking at it, I'll color on it real fast here. The sciatic nerve is this big one right here. And we'll see it more in a bit. But when you're looking for where that sacral plexus is, look for where that sciatic nerve is. That is the biggest nerve in the entire body, and it comes out of the sacral plexus. Any other questions about this model before we move on? I have a request to wait for a moment. I will wait for a moment, absolutely. All right,
I have a question.
When we are looking at these nerves, the plexuses make them all messy. They're all mixed together. But there are some main ones that we need to be able to identify. So that brings us to our nerve man. You have him on the next page. And when we're looking at the spinal nerve man, this is another place that we can locate those plexuses on. But especially what we can see on this one is some of our particular spinal nerves. So let's start with labeling the plexuses that we see on Nerve Man. We start at the very top with that cervical plexus. So here's the cervical plexus at the top. Remember, plexuses always look like a hot mess. So all those nerves that are going up and down and all around, that's the cervical plexus. Down below it, we can see the brachial plexus. So here's that brachial plexus. Then we go down lower. Down here, I can see the lumbar plexus in the lower back. And at the very bottom, that sacral plexus, the sacral plexus. Now we're going to focus on some specific spinal nerves that come from, on my list here, these are all from the brachial plexus. So when I talk about nerves that come from a plexus, what I mean is that if I looked at where they attach to the spinal cord, it's not just through one nerve. So we go through and name the nerves. We can name them C1, C2, C3, all that stuff. Based on the vertebrae that they're next to. But when I'm talking about something like the axillary nerve, I can't say, oh yeah, that just attaches at C5. It actually is a mixture of a bunch of different attachment sites. So we can only name these nerves away from the plexus. So let's start with the first one. The first brachial plexus nerve that we're going to label is this guy right here. And we also see it over here on this side. This muscle that lives right, or this, excuse me, this nerve that lives right in your shoulder is called the axillary nerve. So the axillary nerve is a nerve that can be damaged if someone gives you an intramuscular injection. So if you get a shot in your shoulder and they go a little too deep, you could actually end up with damage to the axillary nerve. When we're thinking about the nerves, we're going to move to an activity in a moment where I ask you to use their location to predict what muscles they might control or where they might get sensory information from. Based on what you know about the muscles of the arm, what muscle might the axillary nerve control? What's the name of that muscle on the top of your shoulder? Do we remember that one? Yeah, exactly. Several of us typing in the muscle that lives on top of your shoulder is the deltoid muscle. So the axillary nerve, because it lives right underneath the deltoid muscle, that's the muscle that it controls. Down below the axillary nerve, we then see this one right here. So this one that I see up here, and I can see it on this side as well. This one that I see over here is called the musculocutaneous nerve. Musculocutaneous. The musculocutaneous nerve is found kind of laterally on your arm, so anterior and lateral. It goes out to some of the skin that's on the front side of your arm. It also helps the biceps brachii muscle to contract. Musculocutaneous, that nerve there. Then we get down into the nerves that go into the forearm. The good news is the first one in the forearm is named based on its location. So this really big one right here, that's in the middle. The big one in the middle is the median nerve. The median nerve. And then check this out. The two that are left, radial and ulnar. Remind me again, when I talk about the radius, is that on the thumb side or the pinky side? Where's the radius found? The thumb side or the pinky side? Exactly. Yep, the radius is on the thumb side. So I know it's hard to tell, but here's the thumb right here, which means that this on the outside on this one, this is my radial nerve. My radial nerve on the radial side, which means that this little one here on the inside, on the pinky side, there's that ulnar nerve. And I'll mention for you, when we look at this arm on the other side over here, they did something that's called pronation, where they took their arm and they twisted it in. So the thumb is now over here. There's the thumb. Here's the pinky. So this down here, this would be that ulnar nerve because it's on the pinky side. And they took that radial nerve and they rotated it around, radial. So we can see those nerves on either side as long as you keep track that the radius is the thumb side and the ulna is the pinky side. You'll be able to tell which is which. We're going to go down into the lumbar and the sacral plexus nerves. When I'm talking about the lumbar and the sacral plexus nerves, oh, I have a request to go back. I will bounce back. Yep. Give us a moment to catch up. Perfect. Okay. When we are looking at the lumbar and the sacral plexus nerves, let's start with the lumbar ones. There's just two that we need to know from the lumbar plexus. So the first one is the one that I see right here in the very middle. And again, I see it here in the very middle. This nerve that I see here in the very middle is called the obturator nerve. The obturator nerve. When we're predicting who the obturator nerve controls, this controls the adductor muscles. Remember the adductor group that lives in the middle of the thigh? The obturator muscle, or excuse me, the obturator nerve controls the adductor muscles. The other nerve that comes off of the lumbar plexus is this, what I see out here. And I can also see it out here. That's going on top of the femur. This is called the femoral nerve. So the femoral nerve is on the top of or anterior to the femur, the femoral nerve. The next nerve that we have is the, to quote a textbook, largest and longest nerve in the body. And I'm going to color right on top of it. It's this big thing right here. This big thing right here that goes all the way behind the femur. And I can see a little bit of it right here going behind the femur. That big one is the sciatic nerve. Sciatic nerve. And I'll mention if you've ever known someone who had sciatica, sciatica is an inflammation of the sciatic nerve, which again is the largest nerve in the body. So if you've had sciatica, yeah, it is the worst. Yes. Literally what's angry is the biggest nerve that you have in your entire body. So no wonder it hurts like crazy because it's that biggest and it's the largest and longest nerve in the body. The sciatic nerve splits, and when it splits into a nerve that goes toward the back and a nerve that goes toward the front. My nerve goes toward that goes toward the front is called the common fibular nerve. Common fibular nerve toward the front, and it's the tibial nerve on the back. So the tibial nerve is more on the back. You can see it a little bit here as well, actually. And that fibular nerve wrapping around the fibula toward the front. So the sciatic nerve splits, becomes the tibial and common fibular nerves. Lom is asking about the femoral arteries. That's a good question. I believe they're actually underneath the femur. I know that they are traveling through the same, if you remember way back from the hip bones week, we talked about that thing called the obturator foramen. That was a big hole in like the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis, that big hole in the bottom. That's for the sciatic nerve to go through, as well as those femoral arteries. So again, I believe they'd be on the back side of the femur, like underneath the femur. Any other questions about the nerves that we're identifying? Okay, for the sake of time, I am not going to go through the activity with you where you're matching up nerves with their muscle functions or their skin functions. But I will tell you that there's a great activity. That's where these pictures came from. There's the guided lesson for this lab takes you step by step through each of those questions about who controls what. So please check out that guided lesson. We're making predictions based on where neurons live or where nerves live, of where they're collecting information from, like we see in this picture, or where they're sending information to, what muscles they might be controlling. So use that guided lesson to help you out with matching up those functions. I am going to take us, okay, we'll briefly do this, and then I got to dive into the back with you. We're going to spend a lot of time in lecture next unit talking about reflexes. When we talk about reflexes, this is your body's ability to respond to something without you even consciously thinking about it. So a good example of a reflex is I touch something hot and I pull my hand away right away. That's a reflex. I like to joke about the stepping on a Lego reflex. You start to step on something, it hurts, you pull your foot away immediately without even thinking about it. So reflexes don't actually involve the brain. We can do them either in the spinal cord, like we see here, or sometimes in the brain stem. We can do them. So when we're looking at this model, all we need to label on this are the parts of a reflex arc. So we start with our sensory neuron, which is what is, or excuse me, I'm going to backtrack. Let me undo that. My sensory, what we're seeing at the very end, because we're having you label that, is actually the receptors. So down here in the skin, the beginning of this reflex arc is we have all these little receptors. The receptors are essentially the dendrites of my sensory neurons. So my sensory neuron is what detects information. Remember that the sensory neurons live inside the bump that's on the back side. Does anyone remember the name of the bump or the abbreviation for the bump that I find on the back side going into the spinal cord? Exactly. Yep, my bump on the back side, the dorsal root ganglion. And remember, I told you that that's where my sensory neurons lived. So you can see them. Here's its cell body. Remember back in the day, we talked about how this was a unipolar neuron. So its cell body lives here in the dorsal root ganglion. It brings in that sensory information. It detects that it's hot. My interneuron is my processor, and it either lives in the spinal cord or it lives in the brainstem, and it's going to figure out what we should do. And when it figures out what to do, it's going to talk to the motor neuron that goes out that ventral root. goes down and it sends directions to what we call the effector, the thing that gets the job done. So there's not much new on this picture, but we are adding in the terminology of a receptor and an effector just to remind ourselves that this is how we do a reflex, how we do stuff without even thinking about it. The one thing I'll mention, because your lab packet mentions it, and we'll talk about it more in lecture class, we do actually have a reflex in your body where we don't have an interneuron, where there's no processing that's done at all. It's just automatic. And that's the kicking your doctor reflex, or also known as the patellar reflex. So the patellar reflex has no interneuron. We go from detecting that our muscle is stretching to automatically contracting it right away. The patellar reflex has no interneuron. That's why it's so fast. All right. Just said that. In the little bit of time that we have left, I need to cruise with you through bones and muscles and movements. So again, I'm not going to be able to cover everything with you. I'm going to do my best, and you'll have to do some work at home. First bone we're learning this week is the scapula. This is your shoulder blade. So when you feel your scapula, the part that's sticking out of your back is this thing right here. This is the spine of your scapula. The spine of your scapula. At the end of the spine, we have a bone marking called the acromion. So the acromion sticks out at the end of the spine. We're going to learn a joint this week called the acromioclavicular joint, where this bone marking, the acromion, meets the clavicle in your shoulder, the acromioclavicular joint. Above and below the spine, we have names for the indentations that we see. So down here is the part that's below the spine. So the infraspinous fossa, remember a fossa is an indentation. The infraspinous fossa below the spine, the supraspinous fossa. That's the one that's above the spine. When we look at the front side of the scapula, meaning the part that if I looked straight through your rib cage and I saw it, I also have an indentation. This indentation is called the subscapular fossa. So the subscapular fossa is underneath. This is where the scapula interacts with your ribs. So this is what's leaning up against your ribs. What you feel on your backside is what we see over here. The one other thing I'll mention for you is our indentation right here. This indentation right here is called the glenoid cavity. The glenoid cavity. And this is the indentation for the humerus to interact with the scapula, the glenoid cavity. When we look from the side, you can see the glenoid cavity again. So you can see that it's that indentation space for the head of the humerus. I can see, so kind of all of what I'm looking at here, a lot of this here is the spine of the scapula, the spine, ending with my point up here, that is the acromion. When I look from this angle, though, I can also see a bone marking we didn't label before, and that's this thing right here. This thing that we're looking at right here is called the coracoid process. Coracoid process. The coracoid process sticks out toward the front. The acromion is more on the back. And remember, because we are looking at this from the side, this is the part that would be on the bottom. So the subscapular fossa, subscapular fossa. Whereas over here is the infraspinous process, or fossa, excuse me, infraspinous fossa. The other bones that we are learning this week are the vertebrae. So the first part that we need to know about the vertebrae is their regions. These are exactly the regional terms that we have. So cervical vertebrae at the top, thoracic vertebrae in the middle, lumbar vertebrae in the lower back, and at the very bottom of the spinal cord is where we find the sacrum. The sacrum is actually made out of vertebrae that have been fused together. So the sacrum there at the very bottom. By the way, I'll mention for you that we have 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, and 5 lumbar vertebrae. So, oh, I lied. It's not 7. I can't remember if it's 7 or 8. I think we have 7 vertebrae and 8 nerves. So it's the times when you would eat meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. That's my number of vertebrae that we know that we have of each of these kinds. These vertebrae look different from each other. In the cervical region, most of them look like this. So most of my cervical vertebrae look like this. But the first 2 cervical vertebrae, the ones at the very top, look very different, and they each have their own name. So we need to know that the very first vertebrae in the spinal column is called the atlas. The atlas is where the skull rests on top of. The way you can identify the atlas is these things right here. So see these flat spaces right here? These are what we call the superior articular facets. These superior articular facets are the places where literally the skull sits on top of your vertebrae. So we have to have this flat place for the skull to sit on top of the vertebrae. C2 is called the axis. This is another one that has its own name. When we talk about the axis, the way you're going to identify that is this part that sticks up. This part that sticks up is the dens. The dens. So if you see the dens, you are looking at the axis. You're looking at C2. When I look at all of my other cervical vertebrae, we can see those things that we already talked about. So here's that bifid spinous process, where I've got the 2 branches at the top, bifid spinous process. We can also see those things called the transverse foramen. The transverse foramen. Every single one of my cervical vertebrae have these things. All of my other vertebrae are going to have just 1 branch on their spinous process. So Seth asked a clarifying question. If there was cartilage between the skull and the facets of the atlas, I believe there probably is, but I also know that that is a synovial joint. So there's also some fluid that is between those as well. So it's not just bone grinding on bone. There's probably a little bit of cartilage in there as well as that fluid to make the articulation a little bit less rough. Yeah, that would be pretty bad if we didn't have anything between. The one other thing I'll mention about the cervical vertebrae, and we'll see this on all of our others as well, is this large part right here is called the body. All of my vertebrae, except for C1 and C2, have a body. This is the heavy-duty part of our muscle, of our vertebrae, excuse me, that holds the weight of the brain and the skull, the body. The body is much bigger when we're looking at thoracic vertebrae. Draw us a line here. Here's that body on thoracic vertebrae, but it's the most large, it's the biggest when we're looking at lumbar vertebrae. When we're looking at lumbar vertebrae and thoracic vertebrae, the shape of the spinous process is the easiest way for us to tell them apart. So see how, here's my spinous process right here. When I look at the spinous process on these two kinds of vertebrae, it looks different, along with some of the other articulations it has. I like to think of lumbar vertebrae as my moose vertebrae. So see, I've got my little antlers up here. These are my articular processes. When I look over here at my thoracic vertebrae, I think of these guys as giraffes. This is my giraffe vertebrae. So the spinous process angles down, and we've got some attachment sites. For example, this would be where my ribs would articulate with me over here. Every single vertebrae, cervical as well as C1 and C2 and all these guys, we've got this big hole. The big hole that everybody has is called the vertebral foramen. Vertebral foramen. Hey, this is not a trick question. What's going to be inside the vertebral foramen? What am I going to have in this space right here? I promise it's not a trick question. Yeah, Seth is exactly right. That's the place where the spinal cord lives. The vertebral foramen. So if I bounce back real fast, I've got the vertebral foramen right here. I've got the vertebral foramen right here. The big hole in all of my vertebrae. That's where the spinal cord goes, called the vertebral foramen. I'm not going to take the time to do joints with you. A note, if you want to make a note for yourself, I'll mention that this word Atlanto means the atlas. So we call it Atlanto for the atlas. All of my other terms either are a bone marking. So gleno is the glenoid cavity. I believe that most of my other joints from today, we had the acromioclavicular, like the acromion. Their names line up pretty well with bone markings or with bone names. Lots of review muscles this week to get you ready for the lab exam. Just a couple of new ones for us to know today. So the first new one is this big one right here. Big one right here, the trapezius. Hopefully we know trapezius. We've got a couple of muscles that live in the back as well. I accidentally drew over one of them. So this muscle that I see right here in pink, this muscle, and I'll highlight it over here as well. This is my infraspinatus muscle. Infraspinatus, named based on the fact that it is underneath the spine of the scapula. I'm going to draw right on top of this one right here. This one right here is called teres major. Teres major that I see over here. Ooh. We're not making you learn teres minor, teres major. I can also see it over here. And the one other new muscle this week is the big one that I see here. This big one that I see here is latissimus dorsi. Latissimus dorsi. Please use this week to take advantage of all of this reviewing, because remember that lab exam is coming up in 2 weeks. It's coming up fast. So take advantage of this review opportunity to remember who lives where and try to predict some of those movements again. When we talk about, let me check. Okay, I'm probably only going to have time to do our regular movements with you. You'll have to do some of those predictions by yourself. When we're talking about my back muscles and what they move, the back muscles move the humerus. So last week we talked about moving the radius and the ulna. This week we're talking about moving the humerus, moving your entire arm. So again, when we're thinking about whether something flexes or extends the humerus, we need to remember what that looks like. So we're not with each other, which means we can act things out and be silly. No one will ever know. When your humerus flexes, it's moving toward the front side of your body. So your whole arm goes forward. When you extend your humerus, your whole arm goes backwards. So flexing the humerus, we move forward. Notice that most of my muscles that do the flexing are going to be attached to the front side of the muscle. When I am pulling it backwards, it's always my muscles who live on the back. If you attach to the lateral side of the humerus as well, you can also assist with flexing. So we say that because my deltoid muscle attaches to the lateral side and my deltoid muscle helps with flexing. The rest of the muscles that help with flexing are ones that live on the front side of the body. Of these three that are here, 1, 2, 3, which number lives on the front? Who lives on the front of the humerus, or who would attach to the front of the humerus? 1, 2, or 3? Latissimus, pectoralis, or teres? 1, 2, 3. Yeah, we're having to rack our mind because it's been a little while since we've talked about pectoralis, right? That's your big muscle in your chest. And it is correct that that's going to be the one that attaches to the front side of the humerus. So I find it on the front side of the body, which means that it's going to attach to the front side of the humerus. So the pectoralis major is going to be one of my main flexors for the humerus. It's going to work together with that deltoid to pull the humerus forward. My other muscles, like latissimus dorsi, which is the big one on your back, latissimus dorsi, helps with extending the humerus. It pulls it backwards because that's where it lives. Teres major also lives on the backside of the arm, or on the backside of the body, excuse me. Because it lives on the backside of the body and attaches to the backside of the humerus, it helps with extending the humerus as well. So when we're considering the movements that these different muscles do, remember that flexion means the humerus comes forward. Extension means it's coming backwards, which means if you live on the front, you do flexion. If you live on the back, you do extension. And we're probably just going to have to memorize that the deltoid also helps with flexion, because that one's a little bit harder for us to just predict. The other movement, though, that we're learning at the shoulder joint, the glenohumeral joint, is abduction and adduction. Remember that when we do abduction, the humerus is going to move up and away. So if here's my humerus, abduction, we move up and away. Adduction, we move back down toward the middle. So when we're thinking about who's going to do what, this one's a little bit harder for us to predict. But if I live on the outside, the lateral side muscles pull me laterally. So my deltoid muscle, it attaches there on the outside. That's absolutely going to help with abduction. What's also going to help with abduction is my pectoralis major muscle. Pectoralis major pulls on the humerus, and by pulling on it, makes it go up as well. My other two that live on the backside things are pulling that bone back toward the body, which means they're helping with adduction, adding it back down. So these rules are not quite as intuitive as other weeks. If you want to flashcard these, I wouldn't blame you. Make sure, though, that we're making those flashcards right away so we actually have a chance to use them before the quiz and before the exam. I don't have a lot of time. Really fast, let's do latissimus dorsi. Remind me, my favorite question, origin or insertion? Who does not move when a muscle contracts? Origin or insertion? Who does not move when a muscle contracts? Exactly. Yep, I asked it the other way to make sure we're paying attention. My origin does not move when a muscle contracts. My insertion does. My insertion goes toward the origin to make an action. So let's start with, since I've got the green, we're going to start with the insertion, the part that moves. The insertion of latissimus dorsi is called the intertubercular sulcus on the humerus. This is a bone marking back from my arm chapter. Intertubercular, all we need to know is it's between the tubercles, it's between bumps. So we're actually attaching to the humerus up here at the top, in between bumps. Intertubercular sulcus. The origin, the not moving attachment site of latissimus dorsi, is the spines or the spinous processes on lots of my vertebrae, and also that thing called the iliac crest on the ilium. Remember that the iliac crest is where we put our hands when our hands are on our hip. And the spinous processes are the middle part of those vertebrae. So the spinous processes and the iliac crest when I put my hands on my hips. Now I'm going to do some connect the dots. So here's my insertion, and I'm going to draw lines between. A little bit down here as well. And now we've got our latissimus dorsi shaped muscle here. So now we have to predict how this is going to work. The first option is whether yours is going to say extends or flexes or extends. When you're thinking about the way that this muscle would work, I'm going to pull out my pointer here. Consider that when I pull on this site, I'm always trying to get this site closer to here. My origin, where we're going toward, is farther to the back, which means I'm pulling the humerus backwards toward the origin. If I'm pulling the humerus backwards, is that flexion or extension? If the humerus goes backwards, flexion or extension? Yep, exactly. If my humerus goes backwards, I'm extending or I'm increasing the angle at that joint. So I'm pulling the humerus backwards. The other way I'm pulling it as well, though, is my origin wants to go toward my insertion. And my insertion is toward the middle of the body. When I move something toward the midline, is that abduction or adduction when it goes toward the midline? Yeah, when I go toward the midline, that is adduction. So use the locations of these attachment sites. My insertion is closer to the front. My origin is closer to the back. Based on that, I'm going to pull this bone backwards. Or my insertion is toward the outside. My origin is toward the middle. I'm going to move this toward the middle, which means I'm going to do adduction. So don't forget about these activities. Oh, I guess that's the only one for this week. That's good. Don't forget about these activities in other packets as well. Next week, we finally don't have any, but that's a good week to play catch up and try to do more with those origins and insertions. Any last minute questions? I'm going to work on building our groups really fast for that group work. Last minute questions, or send me an emoji or a GIF. I know we crashed through this stuff. I'm grabbing my form to put in the chat for us here. I love it. Kaylee's brain is on fire. No, I feel that. Seth nervously trying to copy things down. All right, well, I have put a link to the group work in the chat. I've got groups made for us, so I'm going to open up those rooms here in a moment. Remember, one person from your group submits it. My groups are 2 to 3 people today, so a little bit smaller. Once you're all in there, feel free to get started. And when you're finished, we are done with our lab for the day. So good luck with that assignment. I'll be bouncing around in the chat. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat and I will come find you. So good luck with that group work. I will repost it once we're all in our rooms.